thank you all for being here. My name is Ann Merchant, and we are always glad that you are here and that we are here. And of course, the we is not only I, but
I'm Rick Lovert. I'm the Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a program of the National Academy of Sciences.
Exactly. And of course, we are here for our talk back for the virtual screening of After Yang, which was the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's winner of from the Sundance Film Festival. So we're extremely excited to be able to do that. And of course, one of the topics of the film is AI. And I never fail to mention the relevant work from the National Academy of Sciences. And we do have a host of reports that do relate to that topic. And I think Sachi is going to drop a link in the chat. And it's a very varied kind of body of work that we have, really interdisciplinary, coming from our Policy and Global Affairs Division, from our Computer Sciences and Telecommunications Board, from the Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences. So you can really see that AI touches a lot of different topics in science and engineering. And so I think that that's a really interesting way to approach the topic. But of course, the other way to approach the topic is through the medium of film, where I think it becomes sort of emotionally resonant for people and makes it really human and relevant to a lot of people, which is why the exchange exists. And so, of course, Rick, this is where I hand it to you so you can explain a little bit about the mission of the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
Yeah, so if you're a writer, director, producer, actor, storyteller of any kind, novelist, documentary filmmaker, you have a question about science, you can call us. We've done over 3,400 consults since we opened our doors in November of 2008, including so many movies where people wear full body spandex and shoot lasers from their eyes. So if you have questions about science, please be in touch. And if you are a STEM professional and you're just hearing about what we do and you're interested in being connected with storytellers, please do contact us. Sachi's going to put some info for you to reach to us. I want to thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, without whose support we would not be doing any events, frankly. Also, of course, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which I'll get into in just a second, from whom we get major funding, and also so many individual donors, so many of you in the audience. Thank you if you gave for this event. It goes right back into this programming. Thank you. I want to thank also our team, Courtney, Sachi, Jeff, and Meche, for technically producing these events. Ann and I would be lost without you. We do not know what we are doing technically. So I want to talk about the event structure today just a little bit. We have a moderator and two speakers. First, B Cavello is the Director of Emerging Technologies at the Aspen Institute. And it's rare to find someone so just energetic and infectiously engaging as B. No pressure, B. There you go. We also have an extremely talented and visionary director in Kogonada, who is a favorite at the Sundance Film Festival, as well as a senior programmer from Sundance moderating the conversation. They will be talking in just a minute. We're going to get off screen. If you have a question at any time, just please put it down here and I will forward it on to John. We always get so many great questions. Sorry if we don't get to yours. It's my fault, not John's. If you want to see this after the fact, if you want to check out the recording, it will be on our website. Hopefully Sachi's going to drop a link down there too as well. We get that question a lot. So my rabbit hole for the week, the thing that just caught my eye and I couldn't look away from as we were researching this event. So I have two things. One is the coverage of Samsung's latest generation of robot helpers. They are nothing like Yang, but it's pretty interesting what's coming. And the other is Habitat 2.0, which is Facebook's project to have robot helpers in your home. I do not want Facebook folding my laundry. This is a hard pass for me. Ann?
Yeah, so I had actually looked back at an older article in the New York Times. It was John Markoff's article called "A Case for Cooperation Between Machines and Humans." And it's a provocative call for really limiting the way in which fully automated robots are allowed to fold our laundry or do much of anything else, because it's Ben Schneiderman, who's at the University of Maryland, really warns us that this sort of absolves us of any ethical responsibility for the way in which robots act on our behalf. So it's a very interesting look at AI. And so Sachi has also dropped the link there.
Yeah, so our moderator today is a senior programmer at the Sundance Film Festival, John Nein. For more than a decade, the Exchange has been collaborating with John whenever he calls us up. We always look forward to it. in conjunction with his work with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, with whom we both have a relationship. So the Sloan Foundation gives an award for a film that exceptionally portrays science and/or scientists every year, and John is involved with that. I am so thrilled to have a veteran science and media pro like John on our stage. John, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Rick and Ann. Appreciate it. I'm very grateful to be here. I've been a watcher of many exchange events and have loved all the places those conversations have taken me. So I'm glad to be included here, in part because, and I say this somewhat sheepishly because I hear it so often, I really love films about science and science fiction. And I'm going to try to offer a very quick frame for where we might go today in this conversation that looks at After Yang in a kind of particular lens around its futurism, its world building, and the science that it supposes, how we might relate to technology and how our technology might one day relate to us. So something that's always struck me about science fiction and why it's special, at least to me, is that it's kind of innately aligned with our sense of wonder, the wonder that we have as kids, that we look at the natural world and we wonder how things work, that we look to the stars and we wonder what's out there, or that we project our societies into the future and we wonder what we will be able to make or do. And I realize I'm using science fiction in relation to this film, and I'm the last person, literally the last person, to weigh down a work by putting it into a category. This is a film that exists very clearly as the expression of a filmmaker who has who's a real cinephile and who has so many different preoccupations and interests, and he has a very unique voice. And this is a kind of way of blending some of the traditions and genres, a lot of traditions and genres, but one of amongst them, science fiction. And I think that both with this film and the Alexander Weinstein short story, Saying Goodbye to Yang, from which it is adapted, this is a film that imagines a future world with a technology that exceeds our own, and that brings up certain dramatic situations and certain ideas that wouldn't be possible without that world. And one of them, obviously, is the idea of an artificial being. I didn't realize until a few years ago that the word robot is actually a relatively recent word. It was coined in 1920 in a play called R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, which is written by a Czech playwright and novelist, Karel Čapek. And it's drawn from a Slavonic word that means servitude or involuntary labor. And in the play, a company uses advances in science to produce robot beings that perform basically work that humans don't want to, and they end up rebelling against and killing their human creators. That's obviously not the After Yang that we're watching. This is a film that does not belabor those elements of the story. Its future is not showy, but lived in, and technology is not particularly conspicuous, and yet it's really intriguing. And I think, it's a film that is more about family and memory and human nature. It owes as much to Ozu as it does to the tradition of science fiction, but it's a really beautiful illustration of how expansive a form science fiction can be. And the idea that it has this incredible philosophic reach and can be about ideas. And that's obviously not the kind of storytelling that we associate with the spectacle sci-fi. It's, I guess, what we call more the lo-fi sci-fi. And that's something that I think has been really interesting, at least from my standpoint, watching independent cinema, is to look at the way independent storytellers have explored that genre and have used science fiction to ask really interesting questions. So without further ado, I know some of you have watched the film. I think most of you have watched the film, but I realized that some people weren't able to. So I wanted to level the playing field really quickly and give those people an opportunity to at least get a taste, a flavor of the film. We have, courtesy of A24, who's releasing the film at the end of this week, we have the trailer for the film. So I want to ask that we play the trailer for those people who weren't able to actually watch the film.
Come on, Yang. What are you doing? Come on.
happened to Yang?
I don't know. He shut down last night. He won't restart.
Has this happened before?
No.
If we can't get Yang fixed, we're not gonna buy another sibling for Mika.
It is an interior core problem. I need your permission to break open the core. We've always known that some bots are equipped with spyware. You might not want this bot in your house anymore.
I wish I had a real memory. What do you mean? Did Yang want to be human?
That's such a human thing to ask, isn't it?
May I be honest with you?
Wait, is not being honest an option for you?
Do you want him back?
Of course I do.
I want him back too. I just need a little more time.
What are you watching?
Come on.
Okay, thank you. That is, it's a beautiful film. It's premiered at the Cannes Film Festival last year, and we included it in a very small section of films that we play from other festivals. It was, as Anne mentioned, the winner of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Film Prize, and the filmmaker Kogonada was at Sundance a number of years earlier with a film called Columbus, which one critic wrote was the gem of the festival. They were right. He's an amazing filmmaker, and I'm going to bring him on right now, along with technology and facilitation expert B Cavello, both of whom Rick has already introduced. You have their bios and lengthy bios online, so I'm going to dispense with that for the moment and just get to our conversation. I think, as Rick said, you all have a lot of questions. I'm going to go back and forth between questions that I have and yours, but please post them and we'll get to as many as we can. Kogonada B, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to talk to you both about the film. And I guess I wanted to start, if I could, Kogonada, I was being deferential in the sense of not wanting to call it science fiction purely, but I know you are a real cinephile and admire so many other forms. And I just wonder, like, talking about science fiction as a storytelling form, how you would characterize your interest in that, whether it was as a kid, as a cinephile, as a storyteller, the distinction between lo-fi, sci-fi. What was it that you brought to that and to, what you thought you could do with the story?
Yeah. Thanks, John, and thanks for that really nice intro. I think my first interaction with sci-fi was like a lot of people, the spectacle of it and the escape that it offers, and was fascinated by it. But I do think there were these real moments of discovery for me in regard to what a certain kind of sci-fi, how it could address questions that I was wrestling with as a human, as just someone struggling, with all of these questions of being alive in the present. I think of things, as like, Never Let Me Go. I think of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, things that were speculative and certainly would be categorized that way, but also really integrating it didn't feel so much as other, but also offering a space to really broaden the way we think about things like memory or identity or existence by just expanding the now and allowing other things to things that are not a part of our present, but bringing it into the dialogue of contemporary life. And that was a whole new sort of world for me. And I'm certainly continue to be gripped by that. And it can have a larger scale to it. I think Blade Runner or even Arrival was one of my favorite films of that year. There's something about those kinds of speculative fiction or sci-fi that is always interesting to me, because it both expands for me what is possible, and also gives me a different angle to questions that I've been wrestling with. Yeah.
I'm sure you've been asked this a lot, but I'm just curious if, speaking specifically about the short story, I'm sure there are so many things that could compel you to make a film. Can you just talk a little bit about what it was that spoke to you about that story?
Yeah, I think that it was placed within the context of family, a domestic space, a very everyday kind of space. I had read a different short story there that this producer wanted me to read at first, which was a very large sci-fi story of realities. But I was really drawn to this sci-fi that felt like it was about everyday life within a speculative world. And I've always, longed for that. Even when I'm watching Star Wars with my kids, I'll be like, but what about this family in the background? Do you see them? I wonder where they go grocery shopping. There's this kind of like, once the spectacle, like once that the spectacle is toned down, I'm very interested in how people might get through that day with all this sort of new world environment. So there was something that this, story afforded me, this possibility of exploring domestic life and real fundamental questions of connection and loss and emotional attachment to things that might surprise us. I love this idea of catching up to grief. That was a part of that story. And memory, and it was a very self-contained. It happens over a day. It doesn't involve, it really is about the father, and any kind of reflection he has on Yang is not about Yang's memory, but the father has some flashback memories of moments that he had with him. And then by the end of the day, as he's trying to fix him, he just feels a greater connection than he imagined, like some more emotional attachment. But it felt like the ingredients to really explore something, for me, deeper and more personal. And also the author was an Asian, but this idea of an Asian robot and the construct of Asianness that resonates with me as someone who has struggled with my ethnic identity, and feeling as if so much of that struggle is the construct of it, my perception of Asianness, my longing for it, but what is it actually? So that was another layer that I was really eager to explore.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about that in particular in a few minutes. We also already have a lot of questions around some really interesting things relating to the ethics that are in the film. So I'm going to get to that. But before we do that, B, could I bring you in? Because, today's science is quite a long way from Yang, but there are a number of aspects here that are very much part of work that scientists are doing, and questions that they're asking around AI, around human interaction, around emotional intelligence. You brought up the idea of continuity of thought. So I just wonder, for you watching the film, how did you watch it in relation to some of that research, what we're able to do and what we're not able to do?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that I love that concept of kind of, expanding the now and thinking from what does exist today. There are so many elements of what's embodied in Yang that are very real to our lives. Many of us do have, devices in our homes that are meant to help us out. They could be even used for helping our children and helping us to, navigate large amounts of information, as Yang is certainly really capable of doing. But I think that, when we think about the components, you can kind of think of Yang through the lens of a couple of different kind of scientific and research horizons. So one of those frontiers is around kind of communication and speech. There's a lot of work been advanced super far in the last couple of years, even around synthetic speech and synthetic text, and really beginning to, move us toward the idea of very human-like conversation. Back in 1950 with computing machinery and intelligence, there's this concept put forward of the imitation game known as the Turing Test. The idea that could a person be kind of fooled into believing that this automated system is indeed, another person. And only 14 years later with Eliza, which was a chat bot, that was in some ways fulfilled, right? People are very good at projecting our human-like experiences onto technologies, but the process of moving from chatbots into human-like speech to really being able to hold a conversation continues to be something that's, becoming more and more possible each day, but still elusive in that, there are advances like OpenAI's GPT-3, which is a text synthesizer that, is able to generate incredibly coherent text speech that you might think a human being has written. And there's a lot we could go into there. But it's also something that, related to that continuity that we mentioned earlier, it's also something that has trouble kind of remembering what it already said. It has trouble remembering where in the context of a conversation it is. One of the wonderful things about a conversation like this with other human beings, I think, is that, we can jump back to something that was said at the very beginning. That's still pretty difficult for technologies today. And that's something that I think, as Yang talks about, wanting to have a real memory, there's sort of like an illusion, I think, in ways to some of that. At the same time, there's also the physical embodied element to Yang. There's a sort of, robotic computer system, but it also, there's a conversation around the degrading kind of body and how this, how these technologies interlink and how long something can kind of be preserved as a robot versus as a human being versus one of these kind of synthetic lives. And that's a space that's also seen a ton of advancement recently with machine learning and neural networks. Our robotic systems are getting a lot more coordinated. They're getting a lot better at moving through the world in a less goofy way. We take for granted how incredibly complex our sensor systems are for helping us make teeny little minute adjustments as we move through the world. We're getting closer to that when we talk about robotics, but we're also getting closer in terms of bringing robotics and bringing digital and computing technology into our bodies or into other bodies. I know there's a whole conversation to be had about Neuralink, but I'd also love to talk about things like pacemakers and just really truly the work done to make our bodies not reject the kind of cyborg things that we do to them as a way of extending ourselves. And then the third area that I'll talk about in terms of kind of where things are technologically and research-wise and the science horizons that I think that this film really highlights is that around kind of how people use space. One of the things that I think is really interesting in the film is the really intimate moments within the vehicles as people are moving between spaces, but also the interesting kind of intimacy or not intimacy of the sort of video call that takes place in a restaurant, and thinking about kind of how it is that we bring our social lives with us as we move through the world. Certainly, most of us have devices that we now carry around with us, but we're seeing worlds where we're building more and more of that into our built environment, into our clothing, into our kind of everyday wear. And I think that that's a really interesting space to explore too, is, Yang is kind of discrete and distinctive people, but there's a whole universe of information being collected and stories and memories potentially being stored as a person carries their cell phone with them day to day. And I think that we're at a point where the kind of embodiment that Yang is still a ways off, but many of these kind of slices, many of these different elements are very much our everyday lives.
And you're bringing up a lot of things that relate to the ethics and the idea of responsible AI. And there are a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm promising everybody we're going to get to them because I think it's really rich for conversation. Before we do that, real quick, though, something that was just said earlier, and it relates to a question that somebody has, this idea, Kogonada, that a lot of times the inquiry relating to films about artificial beings is this idea of wrestling with what it means to be human. And I think you've done something really interesting here. You've sort of flipped the question, and you're watching a human try to understand what it meant to be an artificial being. Rick D in the audience has sort of made the comment from the trailer, like, why does everybody want to be a human? What's so great about being a human? And I know you've talked about that. So what was interesting to you about like sort of flipping that question that is often asked and watching someone try to actually understand the experience of Yang?
Yeah, I mean, because and again, it's not that I don't love films that ask that question, and that Pinocchio story, there's a reason why it resonates with us, and we've had versions of it. But I often have, as someone who struggles with being human existentially, I'm not, like, I think the one thing that we humans have is like our origin story and really understanding what it means and the meaningfulness of our lives. And I often thought, well, a robot or AI, they kind of have a real definite sense of their purpose. And this a larger existential question is sort of already answered. But there were other questions that I also thought might be interesting in this case, but in regard to that human notion of projecting ourselves into this artificial being and asking that question. Yeah, I wanted to put that into question, and I have pets, that I adore, feel attached to, but I never think, well, I wonder if my cat wants to be human. I actually think my cat is very happy being a cat. And sometimes I'm like, God, I wish I was more like my cat, who seems so content and doesn't have to worry about the, life like I do. And so, so there was this sort of moving past that question for this particular film. And then you're right. And then sort of flipping it and saying, this idea again, that Jake feels like, oh, he has to fix, for him at that moment, like an appliance. There's not yet a real emotional attachment. And in doing so, that he himself is sort of getting fixed as a human, that there is something about him, in traditional storytelling, we'd be like, oh, he's the hero trying to save this robot. But I wanted to flip that and say, in his attempt to understand this robot, he's sort of saving himself, that it's revealing something in him, revealing it has captured time and memory in a way that he as a human being is overlooking, that he as a human being has been sort of distracted from.
I mean, that brings up this idea of what the ethical obligations are towards the technology that we create. And there are a number of questions from the audience about this, and something I'd like to ask you about. One, for example, Mark, sort of relates the narrative or asks about the relation to the narrative maybe being similar to the idea of a slave-holding family that mourns the death of a slave, but then never considers, while he was alive, the hopes and dreams of that person while they were alive. There's the way in which Jake here clearly comes to terms with the idea that there was a being here, and that's part of the experience. And I also even remember there's part of the short story that I really love, where the two of Jake and Yang are working together doing leaves or something, and they have a beer, and it occurs to Jake that at one point in time this being will be sitting in a basement because it's been outgrown, so to speak. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that idea of the ethical obligations towards this being that's created.
Yeah, I did think about this in a larger conversation, not about the politics of being, just like once you're on, whether you're human or not, and with the possibility of being off, what, and I think it's going to have to expand the way we think about existence and being, and not just place it in the conversation of humanity, and obviously there are people who fight for animal rights who have done that. But I think, again, and I think that's a great question about ethics. I think that, the beginning of asking that question about, are these beings really slaves, is to get to the point where Jake finally gets to, where he's recognizing some sort of value that he actually recognized it as a loss, as long as it's an appliance. There's no kind of sense of relationship or value in the existence. I think we're so used to saying, oh, it's humanity, but I don't know if it has to have humanity as we understand it. And I think the long history of prejudice in our world is that, you just constantly find the other, and so, it could be, the Irish are other in America, and they're not worthy of the rights. And then the Italians, and increasingly, if you find the other, it's not just about exclusion, but it's about the inclusion of those who belong to what we feel like is, worthwhile and worthy to protect and value. And so we just continue to replace that. And then it may be gender, and it may be another, maybe Asians and African Americans. But I think it's our human tendency because to constantly find something that we can cast as other. And until we wake up to the fact that they too should be incorporated into the same rights and values that we might have, we can't ever really confront it. So in some ways, I think it makes it even more, I think, to go back to B's point, if I would have projected Yang, not with human, form, but like as a box that looked like some, bigger version of an iPhone, we might not have that inclination to say, oh, he's a slave, because we're used to this being like serving us. But the question is, if it did in fact have memories and consciousness, those same kinds of questions I think would apply. So obviously I'm just sort of scratching the surface, telling some other, story, but I think I take that question to heart, but I think it's like what you do have to recognize, our the ease of othering anything is something that you always have to fight against and resist.
I thought that there was an interesting kind of allusion to that too. You mentioned not just the kind of explicit lines or sometimes implicit lines that are drawn around the other, but also who gets included in the us. And I think that, the film talking about kind of like clones and other ways of being human even kind of have these various hierarchies to them. And I think that there's some really, tough topics to explore. I highly recommend exploring work from disability justice advocates in terms of thinking like, how do we even define who gets to be human, who gets to be treated as human? But there's so much, that we have not addressed that amongst humans, that introducing other beings into is such a valuable kind of way of reflecting on where we are. But it's also sometimes a little bit spooky to think like, we haven't figured this out yet, and now we're complicating the picture even more.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine a time where there would be something out of humanity that would again unify humanity, but because it's like us, and and maybe who knows what the progression of that would be. But I do think, that's an interesting element of how we perceive us and what is us and them. Yeah.
B, that this area around ethics, responsible AI, this is really something that you work in great detail. And I'm just wondering, there are a lot of hints here around the potential dangers of some of this technology. You have sort of the corporate presence that's suggested here, and the idea of what happens to Yang, that he can be recycled or salvaged, et cetera, et cetera. There's the suggestion of spyware, mining Yang's data. As Dav brought up in a question here, there's the idea of right to repair, which I know is something you're really interested in as well. So I'm just curious, if you want to speak to some of the ways that you read it as a reflection on the work that you do around responsible AI.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there are so many different directions to take things in. And like you said, some of this is about the AI element, and some of it is, this framing of like an appliance, and what are these devices? What do they do for us? What do they mean to us? And what are their impacts, on our lives as we find ourselves depending on them, but also how do we think about what their continued lives are like, even if they are the kind of less humanoid versions of things. And I think that the right to repair element to this story is really interesting on a couple of those levels. So one, the kind of key framing or the key conflict that arises is that Yang breaks down. He stops responding, he stops working. And, Jake and the family are faced with this decision about what to do about this situation. And it's really interesting how incredibly relatable his experience of trying to get customer service support and things are to so many of us who have ever encountered challenges in our technology. And one of the things that I think comes up in this is how absolutely opaque everything is. It's very unclear what Yang's past history has been. It's very unclear which companies are actually in charge of providing services. It's very unclear what you can even do to try to fix things, if fixing things is even possible. And I think that, looking at it through this lens of, if we put aside for a moment Yang as this being with a life of his own, and we even just think of this as this technology that has existed in these people's lives, there are so many things that are really resonant in terms of how difficult it is once you've come to depend on a technology. I think of this sometimes, I like to think about the technologies that are like really, really old school in my life, like shoes. I am so dependent on my shoes. If I go out into the world without them, I'm going to have a bad time. And increasingly, we're building more of these technologies into our lives, and we're really dependent on them. And when they don't work properly, it can be really difficult to figure out, I might be able to recognize there's a hole in my shoe, but it might be really hard for me to figure out what's going on that's wrong with my phone or my computer or other parts of our kind of technologically advanced world. And so one thing that was really resonant to me from kind of the right to repair perspective is like, people they're not empowered to fix these technologies in their lives on their own. There's a whole taboo about opening things up and trying to understand what's going on. There's a lot of proprietary kind of guardedness around how these beings function. There's also this question around, well, what does opening things up mean? Ultimately, they are able to access Yang's previous memories, and in that experience, expose all of these other people's lives, like really intimate moments. And I think that that's really also important as we think about the ethics of these systems, as we think about what it means to really integrate these technologies into our lives. You might have, when clearing out an attic, come across some previous homeowners, like grandmother's letters or something, and there's this like sort of acknowledgement that there are little breadcrumb trails of ourselves that we leave in life. But as we build more technologies into our lives, those breadcrumb trails become incredibly rich, incredibly full of information about our private, intimate moments. And there are ways in which that can be incredibly connecting and, dare I say, humanizing, in terms of helping us recognize, that we are our full selves. But they can also be kind of concerning, like when Jake goes and brings Yang to the repair shop to have things looked at. It's a tense moment, right? It's hard recognizing that there's so much of ourselves that are put into these technologies, and we ultimately, most of us, don't actually know how to extricate that. We don't know what other people can see about that. A lot of the debates, in fact, there was just a hearing in the House today in the US Congress around kind of holding big tech accountable. And a lot of it centered on like, people don't know what's going on. There's not a lot of visibility and accountability. And it's also incredibly hard to separate once you've actually incorporated these technologies into your life.
I feel like this area is so rich, and it has to do with a lot of the agendas that are exposed in the film. Like almost everybody has an agenda, even the ones that seem virtuous to some degree. And that brings up some really interesting questions around, sort of the civic space, the idea of private versus public, all of those things. There are so many awesome questions from the audience, though, that I really want to try to get to some of them. Maybe we can get back to this. But Elizabeth is asking a question, saying intrigued about the role of clones in the world of the movie and why Jake is anti-clone, and that I think Kogonada hints back to something in the short story that sort of alludes to the idea that they're progressive because they wanted to have Yang instead of a clone. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that the role of the clone in the story world?
Yeah. I mean, I think I love that of the short story, and the blind spots that we have. Even I certainly identify as progressive, but that we are, that we have our own and maybe very thought out, and I'm sure he could argue why until he's confronted, by someone who is pressing him on his that sort of perspective. But I also, I did want to kind of create a world in which these things that are huge ideas for us, whether it's clones or AI, had already been lived, and they're just mundane now in this sort of world, and people have positions and all of that. I mean, going back to Ozu, when I watch Ozu films in the 50s, having a vacuum cleaner or a dishwasher is a huge deal in that Japan space. They talk about the catalogs, and I'm sure for everyone viewing it, it was like, oh my God, this is going to change everything. TV in his world. And I sometimes feel like our sci-fi can get stuck right there, that it's just so spectacular to us that everything that is sort of new has a gigantic space in that film. But I love the idea that all of, once vacuum cleaners become a part of our everyday lives, they don't become a real subject of conversation, but we have attitudes towards these things that are just, mundane. And so I knew that I wanted to treat clones not as like, a space for us to all sort of have our view of clones, but that is just a part of our world. And there are people who have, from whatever spectrum, have these sort of differing opinions of it. And of course I have, thoughts about it, but it was really trying to write that to Jake, and part of his own progression of having to rethink otherness in many ways, And as someone who also is in this sort of incredibly diverse family, it almost seems like, he's a representation of someone who has already figured it out, but there's more, more conversation to be had.
I want to ask, I'm sorry, go ahead, B.
I just couldn't help but notice too that Yang himself kind of like seeks out this clone for like not who she actually is, right? Or who they actually are. Like that relationship is also based on like not exactly who that person is. And I think that there's like really interesting layers to, there's the kind of darning the sock idea or ship of Theseus or whatever. There's like ideas of like when, I'll get it wrong, so I'm not going to pretend to know anything about the biological science of like how often different cells in our bodies, change out. But there's this idea of like, who is the true self? And with technologies, it's commonly discussed in kind of robotic science fiction, like, if we replace all these robots' parts, when does it stop being that robot? Yeah. But in this world, we also see Yang kind of like carry out this interesting pattern matching behavior where he sees this person, but that's not who that person is. They're a clone. They're a different version of that.
Yeah, that's a lovely insight. Yeah, that's great.
Well, speaking of who they are, there are, I'm interested in the idea that you brought up earlier, Kogonada, about the notion of a sort of manufactured identity. Is Yang Asian because he's essentially programmed to be Asian? And we see how that is expressed in the film. And this is a question that several other people watching have. Amma is interested in hearing more about the construct of Asian and Kogonada's exploration of that in the film. And there's another question here about, sort of the European non-white AI parallels of othering, the Eurocentric conception of Asians as, monolithic, robotic, certain things. So I just, Kogonada is a big unwieldy topic, but it's clearly something that drew you to it, this idea of identity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real history of Orientalism in the West, and not always for bad intentions. I think there's sometimes real love and aspiration of all things Asian. And then when you are in this world, so just first of all, beyond the sci-fi, just living in this sort of world in which objects represent a culture and an identity, and often presented by Westerners, and then you are trying to make sense of yourself and in that context of objects and the expression of Asianness, both from people who are not Asian, but also within the, so much of Asian cinema has also really defined me, and of course my father and other Asians, and really trying to understand what it means is very elusive, and I think I've come to peace with that elusiveness of so many things, not just being Asian, but being human. I think the elusiveness of all of those questions I'm more at peace with. When you're young, you just want answers and you want to feel certain about certain things, but there is that constant reach for something. But in my own, I think because Yang is such a representation of a kind of corporate manufactured presentation of Asianness for the purpose of transferring Asianness to real Asians. There was a layer to that I wanted to explore, and still exploring in my mind. I mean, I didn't come with it like, oh, here's the ingredients and I have an answer that I want to convey to everybody. It was really like, here is something that is very elusive to me and complex, and sci-fi is giving me an opportunity to rethink my Asianness in the context of manufactured Asianness, and so a lot of that film was really working through that. And one of the things I postulated for whether it's cinematic or human reasons, that his longing again was not to be human, but to have a real sense of place and a sense of this task he was was kind of created to do, and really to get to something that would feel more valuable to him, if he really did. So, all that just to say, it was fertile ground for me to wrestle with my own sense of self,
I want to I'm so glad that there's a question here from Bronwyn about a scene in the movie, which is maybe my favorite scene, and I keep thinking about it. And Bronwyn writes, it's a scene in the movie around preparing and the experience of tea as well crafted. For me, it brought up a philosophical question of perception with Yang's and the father's understanding of tea, both through their different senses and experiences. It also touches on appropriation and being an immigrant. Can you speak to this scene and how it came about? I had a completely different interpretation of the scene, but that's great. That's one of the things that's so great about this. So maybe Kogonada, could you talk a little bit about that scene and what it meant for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that contributed to that scene, that both I found, very personal, and then even formally, to me in the film, you have these sort of robot memories of Yang, which are very, even though the interface to me, I wanted it to be sort of more mysterious. I didn't want to know how it actually worked, but the memories themselves were concrete. They were revisited. They always remained the same. And I knew that these memories were human memories, that it was Jake trying to recollect this conversation, and it has a different, obviously, rhythm to it. It's repetitive. It's not stable. He's trying to get to whatever at that moment is important to him. And, I love that about human memory. It's so, both unreliable and it's elusive, and I think research says that every time you recall something, it changes, but then the conversation that's being revealed, I think it's hard to, I don't want to fully unpack it because there's so many layers to it. But I love that, that interpretation, because so one of the layers is that it was my version of that short story where he's having a soda with his son, and there's a moment of real connection, but also disconnection. And, to me, and it goes into Orientalism as well, Jake loves this this thing. It's an obsession for him, and it has Asian history. And somehow he's never made this connection to he has this resource, and there's this real moment where he's like, oh, do you want me to share these facts? But it's a different level of understanding this craft. And so there were things in that were really interesting to me. There were elements of just finding meaning in something like tea, or for me, cinema, or, pasta or architecture that exist in our modern world. I'm a constant struggler of like, what does it mean to be in this world, and what can give meaning in my life, and the way in which those things you can start becoming disillusioned about that. When film becomes a subject of study at a grad program, suddenly the love and the meaning that it had, as I'm trying to like deconstruct a film in an academic language, I start feeling like I'm killing the thing I love. Or when it becomes a job and you feel burdened, and you have hours, and and so part of it is about Jake and trying to rekindle or reconnect to what has been lost in his life. So it's, it did really provide so much for me and when I was writing that conversation, I genuinely didn't know how that conversation was going to happen. I love that B talked about, I wrote this line about him saying, oh, I lost my train of thought, or like when he tries to recall. And I didn't think I even knew what that meant. It just felt like Yang remained a mystery to me. And when he said that, I thought, is he trying to comfort human beings, or is it hard for him to recall something, and all of that was very interesting to me. So that's not really an answer, but that's one of my favorite scenes.
I love it too. And it's funny that you mentioned relating it to language. And to me, one of the things is that there are two beings who lack the language of experience in common, and therefore they're trying to find something that they do have they're trying to understand through this kind of poetic concept of the tea. It's a beautiful scene. Anyway, it made me think though of something that you had mentioned around the idea of these memories and how they play out, and the interface that exists for Jake to interact with these memories, and how that was intriguing to you around, visualizing file systems and things like that. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, at Kogonada, I'm sure there's like a whole fascinating kind of visual library now that exists of like, how do we navigate computer systems visually, making them interesting in a cinematic sense. And I think that, whether it's like hackers or, all of these different attempts at visualizing memory, there is this draw to make cityscapes, to make webs, to make these kind of three-dimensional spaces. And it was reminding me of kind of how memory in humans is so spatial. It is so physicalized, in terms of like mind palaces and memory maps. And so as I was thinking about this kind of, on the one hand, we see today that, and I think there's a interesting thread to explore too around Jake's relationship with Yang, like the generational difference between seeing something as an appliance versus seeing something as a friend or as a brother or a sibling. But there's also this divide that's happening now. In fact, there was an article recently about computer science students not understanding the idea of the directory of file systems, the kind of hierarchy of information, because they've grown up in an age of the search bar. And you don't necessarily have to have those hierarchies. You navigate things in this totally different way. And so I thought it was really interesting the way that Jake sort of navigates the system, which both has, the seemingly really advanced interface of like swimming through these memories and kind of floating through this space, but also like a refusal to acknowledge voice commands that aren't said in the exact right language. There's these little moments, that concept of expanding on the now. There's these moments that are just like so true to life. But I really liked that kind of juxtaposition of, being in this really spatial environment, this kind of like advanced mind map world that we don't understand. And then also kind of running into those same frictions that so many of us have experienced with our trying to run a basic search.
Yeah, that's great.
We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to get to like at least one or two more questions. Richard asks, clone Ada and original Ada would be quite different people. Yang presumably knows this, which is why he's so careful in approaching clone Ada and not telling her backstory. Was there any thought to exploring clone dynamics, or is that for the sequel?
Yeah, that's for the sequel. That's great. Yeah. I mean, it was fascinating. It was sort of a late, you just introducing it again, like just sort of very naturally that clones lived in the world. But I'm fascinated, I mean, obviously it's in that speculative way. There's so much to explore about all of that. And that's, again, just such an astute observation in regard to, it was like thinking through his feeling of responsibility to the copy and all of that. It's I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah.
Let me ask you real quick, if I could, and maybe you can both comment on this, but Kogonada, the elements of the story that relate to science that are not the Yang and an artificial being, this is clearly a world in which there has been some kind of climate catastrophe, and the architecture of the world reflects that. There are self-driving cars. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that process of envisioning the future and how it's really backgrounded, but in a kind of really evocative way.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really wanted the sci-fi, to be about possibility, and I'm not that interested in, I mean, there's a sci-fi that kind of just borrows the story structure of so many things, which is hero, villain, this sort of mythic structure and fear, being a real driving force of that. But I was just very interested in a future of possibility, not necessarily a utopian one. So, we started this backstory of this society having to contend with nature, no longer being able to, it's no longer a trend. It's just like survival. Like that it's, not sustainable, and I wonder sometimes if like the dystopian worlds we create where there's no grass in sight, like Blade Runner, how that planet even exists, because we already know the dangers of that. So like it was also for me very reasonable to think we're coming to a point where either we annihilate ourselves or we have to make sense of it. So it really was about, and once we had that in our minds, it was about designing that post catastrophic sort of society, which was, really, really a delight. I just want to quickly, because B had such a great, this whole thing about black box theory and just so many things about that discussion. And I wanted to just jump in at one point, because I so much agree with her that it is like such a frustration in my own life, and the idea of what's concealed from us, and language like certified. I mean, we say it throughout, like it's certified refurbished, and it just comforts you. You don't even know what it means, and it might not even be true, but it's like someone has certified it, and all the trust we have with the people in power. And then the other thing that was fascinating to me is the different context in which, because I think genuinely privacy is an issue, and you have the conspiracist in Russ, and it never didn't dawn on me that it could be something very disturbing. But I also like how different spaces look at these things, and it's interesting as a filmmaker talking to someone in the space that B is in, and how important that is, because the museum space, which ultimately suddenly it's transferred to her, and museums are so fascinating because she's interested in the research, the possibility, even though it might be something that's private. And I think about the museum space and how complicated that space is, how they have taken from other countries and other societies, but yet there's something valuable there too, that we that is such a complex space. So I always wanted to bring the museum space into this sort of larger story, which you don't often see in sci-fi, but that's something that has always been a complicated space for me, that has offered me so much and yet stayed complex. So anyway.
I mean, it feels like that is one of the great things about the living in the ambiguity that you do in this film. I see Rick and Ann here, which means that we're officially out of time. I was trying to hold them off. I don't know what the digital version of that is. But wait, before they come on, can we just have Kogonada please tell everybody how to see this film? For those of you who haven't seen it, how can they watch this film when it comes out this week?
Yeah, I think it's in over 25 markets, so you could definitely see it in the theater, and then it's also playing on Showtime for a limited time, and then it'll be available in different ways online. And just thank you again for the organization. B, thank you. That was so insightful, and I wish we could have a longer conversation. There's so much for me to think about and learn. And John, always, I'm so grateful for you and for this conversation. So
this has been super fun. Thank you to both of you. Really fascinating conversation.
All three of you come back anytime.
Yeah, we always wish we could keep going. That's one of the things that we lament at the end of these, that there's not more time. But we do appreciate the time that you did give us, because that's what our audiences are here for. And so thank you for that. And we hope you'll come back next week. Not the three of you, although you're welcome to come back and be in our audience. But we will have next week, we have another speaker, right, Rick? And so we've got a good friend to the exchange coming back with us.
Yeah, Matt, is it Fryman or Freeman? Fryman.
Matt is going to talk to us. That's all we have to know,
Yes.
right? Yeah, exactly. And
But he's going to be talking about the vaccine for all coronaviruses, not just that we've known so intimately over the last couple of years, but
that's right.
all of them. So that's
right.
Conversation. Hey, I want to thank everybody who asked a question today. We had about 50 of them. We couldn't get to all of them. We got to as many as we could. John, you did a tremendous job of getting to a ton of questions, so thank you for that. I want to thank all of our supporters at the $100 level or more. Also, John, Kogonada, B, and also Max Simonson, without whose help we would not have been able to wrangle Kogonada's schedule. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And that's all I had. And what about that?
Exactly.
We're done?
That's it. We're done.
All right. Talk soon, everybody.
Bye.